What I want to talk about now are the nerve pathways going from the cerebrum down through the brain, down to the spinal cord, to the rest of the body. So let's imagine a brain in coronal section again. So we've got this dip in the middle, and then there's kind of an infold there for the temporal lobe, and this will be the cerebrum above. And this is going to tax your drawing skills, but try and make it reasonably symmetrical. Hopefully you'll do better than me, but to try and draw it and see what happens. Now, here we have the coronal section of the cerebrum with the temporal lobe at the bottom. Now, as we've mentioned, the cerebral cortex is a relatively thin layer. I think we said 2 to 4 millimeters thick. It's a thin layer around about the outside of the brain. So this area here will be the cerebral cortex. And as we've said, the cerebral cortex is the grey matter. Now let's imagine that this coronal section is at the level of the frontal lobes in the precentral gyrus. Now, do you remember what functional system was located in the precentral gyrus before the central sulcus? Well, this was the motor cortex. This is where all movement originates. So movement is being originated in these areas here. And of course, we mentioned that the left-hand side of the brain has to communicate with the right-hand side. So here we have bundles of connecting fibres. What were the bundles of connecting fibres called that connect the left and the right cerebral hemispheres? That was the corpus callosum. Remember the corpus callosum connecting the two sides. And as we've just noticed before, there's also ventricles in the brain. So there'll be ventricles just about here, containing the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, below the ventricles, we have the thalamic nuclei. So there's an area of thalamus. That's one thalamic nuclei, and that's another one there. There's the thalamic nuclei. And underneath those, we have these areas called the basal ganglia. That's a bit of an old-fashioned name. The more modern name is basal nuclei. But the thalamus and the basal ganglia, or the basal nuclei, are areas of grey matter within the cerebrum, within the white matter of the cerebrum. So here we have the basal ganglia. Maybe do these a different colour. They're the basal ganglia. And right down at the base of the base of the brain, the base of the diencephalon, is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus would be the nuclei down here at the bottom. Now, movement is initiated in the motor cortex. And I don't know if you know, but sometimes, you know the wires at the back of your computer, they get all tangled up together. Well, if there's lots of nerve fibres in the brain, we wouldn't want them tangled up. So they have to form neat, they have to be in neat order. So all of the nerve cell bodies that initiate movement are up here in the motor cortex. And these all come together into a central pathway like this. The nerve fibres of the motor neurons project down into the cerebrum. They're sometimes called projection tracts. And then they all come together to form a single capsule that carries these fibres down through the brain. And this area here, carrying these fibres down through the brain, is called the internal capsule. So the nerve fibres from the motor neurons go down through the projection tracts, and they're all kept nice and neatly together as they go down through their side of the brain in the internal capsule. And the nerve fibres carry on going down. And as you might remember, just here we have the brain stem. And these fibres carry on going down. And they go down, in this case, the left side of the brainstem. And it's the same situation on the other side of the brain. Here we have the different nerve fibres, projection tracts, all coming into the internal capsule, all going down that side of the brain, going down that side of the brain stem. But as you know already, it's the left-hand side of the brain that controls the right-hand side of the body, and the right-hand side of the brain that controls the left-hand side of the body. So the left-hand side of the brain is controlling the right-hand side, the right-hand side of the brain is controlling the left-hand side. And these fibres actually, to facilitate this, cross over just there, just above the level of the medulla oblongata. So these ones cross from that side to that side, and then they carry on down that side of the spinal cord. These ones from the right-hand side of the brain cross over at the base of the medulla oblongata and go down the left-hand side of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is continuing down here. And these bundles of nerve fibres carrying the motor impulses are going down. And then these leave the spinal cord via 31 pairs of spinal nerves to take the motor impulses out to all parts of the body. The situation is very similar with sensory pathways. The sensory nerves are going to come in, again through the same 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So in this case, they've come in from the left-hand side of the body. They're going to go up the left-hand side of the spinal cord. But here they're going to cross over, carry on up through the right-hand side of the brain and go to areas of the sensory cortex. Where is the sensory cortex located? After the central sulcus, in the post-central gyrus, where sensation is perceived. Now, it's very important to understand the pathways through the brain, because this main area, these are sometimes called the pyramidal tracts or the corticospinal tracts. The corticospinal tracts are carrying information from the cortex down the spinal cord. So this is sometimes called the corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tracts. But they're also called sometimes the pyramidal. The pyramidal tracts. And the reason for this is that if you take a cross-section of the brainstem at round about this level, and we look at the cross-section of, say, the medulla, then these nerves of the corticospinal tract are travelling very near the surface of the medulla. And in fact, if you look at them in cross-section, they're not round, they're more triangular shaped. And someone thought they were pyramid shaped. So the pyramidal tracts are carrying this information up and down. So this is sometimes called the corticospinal tracts or sometimes the pyramidal tracts. It means actually the same thing. This is the main fast way that nerve impulses are carried up and down through the brain stem and to the spinal cord. And the sensory ones going back up again. Now I thought I'd show you these just for fun really, but this is called the sensory homunculus. Now if the body had a 1-to-1 ratio with the equivalent area of the sensory cortex, this is what would look like. So lots of the sensory cortex is the tongue and the lips. This is important so you can pick little bits of grain out of your food and so you can feel things and control what's going into the mouth quite accurately. It also explains the popularity of kissing. You get a lot of sensation from the lips. And then if we go down, we see that the hands are positively huge as well. And again, this is so we can feel exactly what's going on with the fingers, so we can feel what we're doing, we can sense things very precisely, and then move them accordingly once we've got that sensory information. So that is the cortical man, if you like, of the sensory homunculus. And this is the motor homunculus, the motor equivalent. So again, this is the size that the body would be if there was a 1-to-1 ratio between the amount of neurons in the motor cortex and the size of the body. And the key thing here is you can see the mouth and tongue are quite precise. That facilitates speech and allows us to suck food and things like that. But look at the size of the hands. Humans have got such fine motor control in their hands. But this is only because there's a massive amount of neuronal processing power in the motor cortex, which is controlling this very fine, sophisticated movement. So this diagram is showing the corticospinal tracts through the brain. Nerve impulses arising in the motor cortex, down through the projection tracts, through the internal capsule, down through the corticospinal pyramidal tracts of the brainstem, crossing over at the level of the lower medulla oblongata and going down the opposite side of the spinal cord. So these impulses originating the left-hand side of the brain, crossing over, going down to the right-hand side of the spinal cord, and of course the spinal nerves taking these impulses out. 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now the converse of the pyramidal system is the extrapyramidal system. So impulses still arise in the motor cortex as usual, go down through the brain, but here the impulses are processed in the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei. And this is particularly important with fine movement control, with initiating movements and stopping movements and making movements fluid. It's kind of elaborating, if you like, and refining the movements which are generated in the motor cortex. And from here, the impulses go through these dark areas in the midbrain called the substantia nigra. So these impulses are going down through the brain rather than in the anterior pyramidal tracts. They're still crossing over to the other side and going on down the spinal cord, and they're still leaving via the spinal nerves. But the raw impulse from the motor cortex has been refined. And all of this system here, the basal ganglia, the substantia nigra, this is called the extrapyramidal system because the impulses are not, the nerve fibres are not in the pyramidal tracts. The nerve impulses are going down via an extrapyramidal route, not via the pyramidal normal corticospinal route. So it allows for much finer control. And it is this extrapyramidal system working on dopamine which goes wrong in Parkinson's disease, explaining the rigidity and tremor that we see in Parkinson's disease, when the fine control mediated by the extrapyramidal system is lost.